Clucky was a fantastic example of the Gallus domestica subspecies. Once mature, she laid 1 egg per day for her whole first year of laying. What more could be asked of her? Clucky was the result of many years of selective breeding for both egg and meat quality, and was so immaculate that she was chosen to be the representative for her species in the Domestic Animal Biology 1100 lab. This feature film is dedicated to Clucky's short but fascinating existence. We will begin with Clucky's outer features. Even in death, she looked damn good. We will begin with the ear and the earlobe. The earlobe is the modification of skin located below the opening of the ear. The earlobe and the ear opening's color correspond to the color of the eggs that the chicken will lay. Clucky's ear anatomy was white, which matched beautifully with her brilliant white eggs. The comb and wattle in chickens vary in size and color depending on sex and breed of chicken, but they serve ornamental purposes. Clucky had a brilliant red comb and wattle that decorated her beautifully. Clucky also had a thick and full coat of white feathers that helped her with her temperature control and skin protection. They're arranged in lines called tracts and are made of keratin. When the chicken goes through a process called molting, it stops egg production and the feathers are lost, starting from the head and going towards the tail. We are now able to create conditions that don't allow chickens to molt, and breeds of chickens have been made and found that can molt while still laying eggs. Clucky had a triangular toothless beak that contained a small tongue that is used for moving food around more so than tasting food. The oral cavity grinds up food so that it may be swallowed easier. Lastly, Clucky had a uropygeal gland, or a preen gland. The uropygeal gland is a big bilobed gland located underneath the chicken's tail that secretes oil. Clucky distributed this oil onto her feathers when she preened them, making her look shiny and beautiful. Next, we have the respiratory system. Avians are different from mammals in the structure of the respiratory system. Birds like Clucky have air sacs which expand and contract similar to lungs in mammals. The respiratory system begins with the inhalation of air that travels through the glottis, down the trachea, and into bifurcated principal bronchi. On the distal end of the trachea, the phonation organ called the syrinx is found. The primary bronchi extend into the lungs, which remain stationary, where they give rise to secondary bronchi, which then results in hundreds of parabronchi, where gas exchange takes place. These bronchi all run along the air sacs in the lungs, which are very thin-walled extensions of the respiratory wall. They expand and contract based on inhalation and exhalation. Unlike in mammals, inhalation is caused by the ventral movement of the sternum and the cranial movement of the thoracic cage, which lowers atmospheric pressure in the air sacs. This causes air to move into the lungs and air sacs. When the sternum and thoracic cage move in the opposite direction, there is an increase in atmospheric pressure, which forces air out of the respiratory organs. This is an extremely efficient way of moving air throughout the organs and facilitating gas exchange. Birds also don't have any sweat glands, so the respiratory system serves to regulate body temperature. Next up is the digestive system. The overall passage of food ranges from 2 to 24 hours in chickens. It is fastest in growing and laying chickens like Clucky was. Food starts at the beak, which crushes or tears it. It then moves into the mouth, which has no lips or teeth. At the caudal end of the oral cavity, there is the opening of the esophagus. Also in the mouth is a triangular-shaped tongue with few taste receptors, but a multitude of touch receptors. The tongue doesn't contain many muscles like the tongues of mammals. Next is the esophagus, a muscular tube that runs parallel to the trachea. This organ serves to transport food from the oral cavity into the crop, a storage sac for food that is located between the esophagus and the proventriculus. The proventriculus is the glandular stomach, which secretes HCl, which has a pH of around 0.7 to 2.3, peptic enzymes, and mucus for digestion. The proventriculus is the first chamber of the chicken's bipartite stomach. Next is the gizzard, which is the second chamber of the chicken's stomach. It is an organ with thick muscular walls, and the inner surface is extremely rough. When the muscles contract, the gizzard grinds, mixes, and mashes food into a fine paste. The food then moves into the small intestines, which is made up of the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. All of these parts are held in place by the mesentery that attaches the organs to the dorsal abdominal wall, while also supporting mesenteric arteries and veins. The function of the small intestine is the absorption of nutrients from the food material brought into the gastrointestinal system. Next is the pancreas, which is located within the duodenal loop of the small intestines. The pancreas utilizes ducts to communicate with the duodenal lumen. The ducts are normally hidden by the tissue, but there are usually 2 or 3. Finally is the intestinal ceca. The intestinal ceca contains a bacterial population important in the digestion of plant cellulose and reabsorption of water. It is also the place where volatile fatty acids are absorbed, but is not all that important when chickens are fed highly digestible feeds that are easily broken down. Don't forget about the liver, which is the largest gland in the body. It has only 2 lobes in chickens as compared to the 4 in mammals. The liver is a reddish-brown organ that serves to filter toxins out of the blood. The liver has a coronary ligament, which attaches the liver to the pericardium, and the falciform ligament, which fixes the ventral surface of the liver to the ventral body wall. There is also the gallbladder, which is the organ that stores bile and is a greenish color. The colon, or large intestine, is the last location of water reabsorption. The colon in the chicken is relatively short compared to that of other species, and it leads straight to the cloaca, which is the organ through which all fecal matter exits the gastrointestinal tract.
Next is the internal organs. Placed in the abdomen, Clucky's liver is a large red-brown 4-lobed gland. It is attached to the pericardium by the coronary ligament. Here we appreciate the beauty of Clucky's kidney, a 3-lobed structure nested perfectly in the bony cavity formed by the ileum and the sacrum of the pelvis within the abdomen's dorsal cavity. It is critical for the removal of nitrogenous metabolic wastes, as Clucky has no bladder. Clucky's spleen is a small unilobed organ. Its dark purple color can help it stand out in the crowd. Clucky was so sweet, we thought that she had a heart made of gold. Her actual heart is bright red, with 4 distinct chambers all encompassed by a thin film called the pericardial sac. Like all of her avian relatives, her aortic arch is reflected to the right. Those chambers are called atria and ventricles, with 1 on each respective side. While it was still beating, this magnificent organ pumped blood through several arteries, including the brachiocephalic, carotid, and subclavian, as well as the aortic arch, abdominal aorta, and hepatic portal vein. Next is the reproductive system. Clucky again followed suit with her fellow avian friends, and only her left ovary was developed. As a mature laying hen, Clucky had several yellow follicles present that varied in size. The largest one would have ovulated first, and the smallest one last after it had time to grow and mature. These follicles mature through a hierarchical system. After the oocyte ovulated, Clucky's infundibulum was always there to catch the oocyte and help it find its way into the magnum. It also helped store sperm for those times when Clucky just wasn't feeling it. The magnum is the next part of the journey. This dark pink, thick, walled glandular portion of the oviduct secreted albumin and other proteins that were beneficial to Clucky's future young. The oocyte would reside here for roughly 2 hours. The isthmus is the next leg of the oocyte's journey. Gave it a thin-walled resting place for another 2 hours while an egg membrane was formed. The shell gland in the uterus was where Clucky's oocyte would become exhausted and choose to reside for roughly 20 hours as it received a shell and pigmentation. The vagina was the oocyte's final resting place, where it would wait patiently between the shell gland and the cloaca. Sperm would also be stored here in glands at the junction between the vagina and shell gland. The cloaca is the opening where Clucky's young and metabolic waste would both leave her being. It's light pink in color, it is slightly raised and found at the end of the reproductive tract. Clucky was not alone, and the shell of the egg we found in her isthmus was completely calcified. Our guess is that this egg has been in the oviduct roughly 20 hours since ovulation. We soon would have a Clucky Jr. Clucky's husband had 2 distinct internal features that attributed to his manhood: his testes and his vas deferens. The testes were 2 large, pink kidney bean-shaped organs that contained many blood vessels and were a major site of sperm production and storage. They also produced hormones that influence the development of secondary sex characteristics. The vas deferens is a tubule that connects to the testes and brings the sperm to the cloaca to be excreted. Clucky was a very active bird. never wanting to be tied down and always up for an adventurous flight. Without the power of her intricately amazing muscles, she would never have been able to achieve the feats she did. Thus, we may pay tribute to these muscles. First, we have the biceps brachii. With its double heads finding their origin near the shoulder joint and the proximal end of the humerus, this muscle flexed Clucky's wing, running ventral to the humerus. It inserts at the proximal anterior surface of the radius. The triceps brachii is the neighboring muscle. This one finds its origin at the scapula and the proximal humerus. Clucky was able to extend her forearm and flex her shoulder thanks to this beauty. It inserts at the olecranon process of proximal ulna. In the deltoideus, we recognize its beauty through its sheet-like appearance, finding it at the proximal clavicle and inserting it into the deltoid tuberosity of the proximal humerus. We were able to see its glory every time Clucky rotated her wing outward by flexing her shoulder. Clucky's largest muscle was the superficial pectoral. It contributed most of the force she needed to move her wing downward. It originates in the sternum, furcula, and sternal ribs, and is inserted in the ventral surface of the humerus. The supracoracoideus muscle enabled Clucky to soar high. Elevating her wing in its upstroke, it used a mechanism similar to that of a pulley. It originates in the sternum funicular sternal ribs and inserts in the proximal dorsal surface of the humerus. The iliotibialis was a thick sheeted muscle, one that we admired Clucky for. Every time she strutted her stuff to attract those roosters, we knew that her hip was extending that knee and flexing that lower leg. It originated in the pelvis and inserts in the proximal tibia and the patellar ligament. Contrary to its neighboring muscle, the serratorius muscle was thin-banded as it ran along the anterior border of the thigh. It worked with neighbors to flex the hip and extend the knee. It originates in the lumbosacral area and inserts in the patellar ligament. Those thighs, though. The semitendinosus muscle showed us just how great they were by extending them. It originates in the ilium and ischium and inserts in the caudal femur. In conjunction with its neighbor, the semimembranosus helps with thigh extension and gave us some knee flexion action. It originates in the lateral surface of ischium and inserts in the caudal surface of the tibiotarsus. To look at the quadriceps femoris, we need to observe Clucky from a medial view, where we found it lying posterior to the sartorius. It also extends the thigh. It originates in the ilium and inserts in the patellar ligament. The ambiens muscle originates in the ilium and pubis and inserts in the proximal tibiotarsus. Clucky was all about that thigh action, so she used the abductor longus muscle a lot to abduct and extend her legs. This originates at the ventral border of ilium and pubis and inserts in the distal femur. As a traveler, Clucky spent a large amount of time walking in addition to her flying, and so the gastrocnemius muscle was crucial in helping her extend that knee and flex that foot. It originates in 3 heads at the distal femur and the proximal tibiotarsus and inserts in the tuber calcaneus. Clucky had some beautiful feet, and so she loved to use the tibialis anterior to flex her tarsometatarsus forward.
Thank you for watching. Rest in peace, Clucky.